Welcome to the 31st Desmond Greaves Summer School. I hope that you'll find the various sessions over the weekend of interest and stimulating. Just by way of information, the most recent previous schools are now accessible on the school website, so if anybody wants to check those out, they'll be able to do so. Also tonight, we're trying out live streaming. It's only a pilot run, and we're only going to do it in a very limited way. But we talked about it for 2 years, and we thought we may as well get going on it. So that's just thing, but that'll not involve anybody's any issues or anything like that. It's only the speakers, and as well as that, it's only the actual contributions. So I think we're maybe limited to that this year, rather than doing the debate. I should say, is that okay with is that okay with you, Ray? Because we okay, so that's it's just dawned on me that I was supposed to ask them, well, I didn't. So it was but it's worthwhile, I think, that we start the process. Just emergency exits, the back and the front. Toilets, there's only one of the toilets at the back is in use, and to put it delicately, the seat on the toilet is a bit delicate, so just be careful. There's no but just and the other toilets are out here and down the stairs, first on the right and down the stairs. Also, the last session, and I'm going to be announcing this over the weekend so that people are aware of this. Normally, the last session starts at 2:30. The afternoon sessions start at 2:30. But in relation to the last session on Sunday, Claire Daly, who's one of the speakers, has to leave to fly out at 3:30. So we thought we would bring the start of that session forward to 2:15. So I'll keep reminding people of that, and we'll want to try and get going at that 2:15 to enable people to listen to our presentation, but more importantly, maybe have a bit of exchange about what is a very, very important issue, which is EU militarisation and Irish neutrality, and how we can build up the opposition, and particularly what role MEPs possibly can play on that. Also, what is involved in terms of the EU Parliament's attitude towards EU militarisation, whether indeed there is the basis for anything in the EU Parliament. And in relation to the climate change session, unfortunately, Mick Quinn, who is a member of the committee and who was very much to the fore in pushing that topic, has had a bereavement on Wednesday. A very close family relative has died, and Mick O'Reilly has very good he's stepped in to the breach in relation to that, and he'll chair that session. So without further ado, I want to hand you over to the chair for tonight's session. Ray Bassett spoke last year. He made a very good contribution. There was a very good positive feedback from it, and it's great that he's coming back tonight to chair this session. By background, he's a natural scientist, and then he went into, as most of you are aware, went into the diplomatic service and worked in there. Was very closely involved in the whole background to the Good Friday Agreement. Has a very good feel and a very good sense of what is involved in that, and has very good connections on both sides in the north. He has come very much to the fore in terms of very incisive commentary on the whole Brexit process and Ireland's relation with that. So he is an excellent person to chair this session. And without further ado, I would hand over to
introduction. That's almost that was the last time, which is I'm essentially just going to chair the event because we have two fantastic speakers, two really top quality speakers, and both of whom I have a huge amount of admiration for. And the session here, Britain, Ireland, EU, couldn't be more topical at the moment. One thing I don't think anyone's going to be able to give you an accurate assessment of what's going to happen in the next 48 hours, never mind what is going to happen over a longer period. But it is very, very important that we have meetings like this because, in Ireland here, we tend to be subject to a suffocating level of uniformity in the media and the establishment and that. And there's a huge EU industry out there who, try to squat anybody who puts their head above the parapet. And, I was in government circles and things like that, and I could see it at close quarters. There's such a level of intolerance for people who hold contrary views. You can hold contrary views on almost anything, but when it comes to the European Union, it's one of the last sacred cows in this country, and we very, very badly need in this time, this heightened time of controversy and danger for our country, that we should have a proper and open debate. So I think the two speakers we've got tonight here are people who can make an extraordinary contribution to that. The two speakers are going to speak each for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a question session. We'll try and get as many questions in as possible. But the first speaker is Will Podmore, and Will wrote this book, Brexit, The Road to Freedom, and I'm going to do an advertisement. It's for sale outside as well, and it's well worth a read. I read it well before I knew Paul. Will was coming here tonight, and it's an important contribution because it's an important contribution to the Brexit debate from somebody who is Eurosceptical, but Eurosceptical from the left-wing position, and also particularly from a trade union point of view. And we don't hear that very often because anybody who speaks in favour of national sovereignty or people having control of their own destiny, which used to be a very left-wing business when I was growing up. National liberation, sovereignty was a very left-wing cause, but now anybody who does it is painted as an extreme right-winger. So it is important to challenge that narrative, and Will is the very person to do that. Now, Will is a member of the University and College Union, and head of learning resources at the University College of Osteopath. It's quite hard to say that, I'm sorry. It must be in my Art Dublin upbringing. And has written a whole series of books. But this is an excellent book, and to be quite honest, I plagiarise it myself regularly, but I do contribute, and really looking forward to your contribution tonight. So do you want to take the microphone and give us the benefit of your wisdom?
Dr. Bassett, distinguished colleagues, I'm greatly honoured to address this famous summer school. 2019 looks like being a decisive historic year for the people of Britain. but that's about as far as I'm going to go in terms of forecasting. Please don't expect me to be able to tell you what will happen in the next 24 hours, never mind the next 24 days or 24 months. We've had so many unexpected events already in the last few weeks of the new Prime Minister's and new government's instantiation. I'm going to start off by talking about sovereign states and transnational companies. Sovereign states are all that now stands between the peoples of the world and utter domination by the transnational monopolies. They think the world is theirs to exploit. They subordinate everything to one measure, profit. Anything that stands in their way is to be destroyed, especially established wages, conditions, standards of living, rights, and especially nations. Because nation states are indeed the fundamental sites of democracy, the only way that people have so far been able to impose any kind of social control over the operations of private capital. Monopolies' needs are really quite simple. They want to be able to exploit, to shift goods, factories, people, investment, anywhere in the world. And they want all countries in the world to sell their products. Giant corporations. Don't you just love them? So, these corporations, whether they're based in the USA, Europe, China, Russia, they don't love the EU. It constitutionally guarantees the free movement of capital, goods, services and persons. That's the term in the EU treaties. Now this word persons has a double meaning. On one hand it refers to people as workers. Free movement, which can be used and is used to drive wages down, turning a whole continent into a reservoir for potentially cheaper labour, a reserve army of labour. But a company is also a legal person. And free movement gives companies the right to switch countries in search of lower and lower labour costs, and in the process outlaw workers' actions to prevent this. These principles are the free market made law, neoliberalism as a constitutional imperative. To call them freedoms is a mockery of the word freedom, because the freedom of the people counts for nothing in the face of the wishes of capital. And the EU enshrines these principles as permanent. And the EU cannot be reformed. It's been built to ensure the eternal rule of the monopolies. The EU is an agent of transnational capital. Treaties like TTIP were designed by the EU and the USA to get around the refusal of the countries in the World Trade Organization to accept these transnationals' demands. To reform it, to turn it into a weapon against the monopolies, as some dream, would involve a treaty change endorsed by every single member country. Even the famously hard to change American Constitution requires just 3/4 of the states to approve a change, not the whole lot. The vote in Britain to leave the EU has been a huge blow to the transnationals. Those who think they can overturn our referendum result and yet still oppose the transnationals are engaging in self-deception. The EU stands for not for progress, but for reaction. Now the next stage I'm going to start talking about the people of Britain. In particular in this case. The people are at the heart of all progress. Only the people kept Britain out of the euro. Only the people forced Parliament to agree to hold the referendum. And only the people's pressure to make decisions about Britain in Britain delivered the 17.4 million votes to leave. And only the people, the weight, strength, the determination, the persistence of that resolve since that vote has stopped has stopped the pro-EU establishment from overturning our referendum decision. And we've seen off 2 Prime Ministers, disastrous David Cameron, tin-eared Theresa May. In 2014, hugely significant this, very important, the people of Scotland voted to stay in the UK. As a result, in 2016, the people of Scotland voted as part of the people of the UK. And no minority, however self-defined, has any right to veto the decision of a majority in a nationwide vote. In a democracy, there is no moral right for a minority vote to prevail over a majority vote. In the 2014 referendum in Scotland and in the 2016 referendum on the EU, the government said it would implement the result. Both camps in both referendums promised to respect that result. In Scotland, the government implemented the result, but the Scottish National Party immediately broke its word by starting at once to up its campaign to overturn the result. And after the EU referendum, the May government broke its word and did not implement the result. Instead, days after the referendum, it pushed forward the European Defence Union in secret, and they did this far faster than they did anything to carry out the decision that they'd asked us to make. It's well worth looking at, and may seem a bit unusual, but it's worth looking at the Veterans for Britain website for detail about how the government immediately acted to try to overturn the decision that it asked us to make. Now, who owns Brexit? Some people think it's all about one politician or another, Farage, Johnson, Gove, take your pick. But it was never about what this or that politician said. Nor can it be left to the politicians to implement, while the people go back and sit and watch on the sidelines and cheer on, if or not. The nature of populism is important to understand. It depends which country you're talking about. One people has a different populism from another people. It depends on their history, their culture. So a populism in a country like Britain, which has very strong anti-fascist traditions, is very different from populism in Italy. Brexit is not about Nigel Farage or Boris. The referendum was about the country's future, not about any particular politician's future. It wasn't about what anybody thought or felt about any particular individual. It shouldn't have been. One can support the cause of British independence without in any way supporting any of its cheerleaders. I know some people who voted to stay in the EU because it was the only way they could vote against Nigel Farage. They thought that was the most important thing to do, rather than to think about the future of their country. Everything that's happened since the referendum has proved that the pro-EU camp lied when it said it was all about Nigel Farage. They said he'd become an MP, or a Prime Minister, or a Lord, or our ambassador in Washington. Where is he now? Well, he's still MEP, yeah, but he's not an MP, he's not in the House of Lords, and he's certainly not in the Washington Embassy. And some pro-EU people moved all too swiftly from trashing Farage and Johnson to trashing Leave voters. In fact, some even moved to trashing the whole British people, insulting us. It was reported today in the Irish Times that John Major, in 1995, told President Clinton, quote, "For most people here, Ireland is just another island. They don't really care about people, about what happens in the world." Well, I think that's one, inaccurate, and two, rather insulting. Our referendum wasn't about individual politicians, nor was it about the media. Why assume that we took loads of notice of either? Those of us who voted leave, obviously we ignored the claims by the pro-EU politicians, Cameron, Tony Blair, reliable truth-tellers both. Yet some claim, without evidence, that we must have believed whatever nonsense Boris or Michael Gove came out with. We didn't. The point is we said, plague on all your houses. Oh, plague on a whole lot of you. We make up our own minds, thank you very much. The simple question, remain or leave? And we chose leave. Unforgivable. Some focus still on the lies told in the campaign. This is to assume that the vote was procured by lies told by the Leave camp, that people voted to leave because we believed those lies. But did no pro-EU politician ever lie once during the campaign? And were their lies what made pro-EU voters vote the way they did? No, this whole approach obscures the simple, unbearable truth that people went into that voting booth and they did their best to answer the question in front of them. And we voted to leave by a majority. And the vote was on the question whether we wanted...
Microphone.
Sorry. The vote was on the question of whether we wanted decisions made in the UK when they affected people in the UK. Now, what did we vote for in 2016? We voted to leave. We didn't vote to stay unless we got a deal. There was nothing about leaving but only with a deal on the ballot paper. And leaving only with a deal actually gives the EU a veto, doesn't it? Gives them a veto on our leaving ever, which is what the pro-EU camp wants, but it's what we voted against. The question was, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? This was a question about whether we wanted to stay in that political body or not. No mention of the words nationalism, internationalism, racism. It said nothing about what people might or might not believe about remaining or leaving. It said nothing about what else they might or might not have wanted. It said nothing about any conditions, possible or impossible. And it wasn't about what any politician on either side said or promised. So what people actually thought about the Leave campaign is irrelevant to the question we were asked. And some people, I'm afraid, are still refighting that 2016 campaign, trying to rewrite the history and still misunderstanding what it was all about. It was never about migration policy, never about racism. It was about who makes the laws of the country, the MPs we elect, or the EU, which we don't elect and don't control. But the British ruling class, on the whole, doesn't want to obey the working class instruction. And the pro-EU ruling class is proving Marxists right to claim that the ruling class would tear up democracy to keep their control. Attacking Brexit is not attacking racism or reaction, as they pretend. It is attacking democracy. Now, to bring it more up to date, back to Boris Johnson. He launched his leadership campaign on the 24th of May with a pledge. Britain must leave the EU by 31st of October, deal or no deal. Now we, the people of Britain, must hold him to that. We can't leave it to him to deliver it. Some say they want independence, but then say that only if people vote the way they want. Just like some pro-EU people who claim to want democracy. They don't want it if people vote the wrong way, though. Within that 17.4 million Leave vote, a new knowledge is developing, more dangerous for the corporations. The corporations still think they can buy influence, they can buy politicians, buy power, but sovereignty is in the people, it's not in the parliaments. We voted that we, the people, take control, not for Parliament to ride roughshod over us. And these 17.4 million Leave voters I've helped to create a party with Brexit as its name. Local organisations have sprung up around the country, re-energising the fight for independence. There's one in Brighton called the Jolly Brexiteers. They run street stalls, they leaflet, they agitate. They went up to Philip Hannon's constituency to agitate against him. In my borough, in Redbridge in North East London, we had a Leave campaign. Communists, Labour Party people, Conservatives, UKIP, across the board, we united simply to defend democracy and to uphold democracy. So this 17.4 million, the majority, voted in what was agreed by the Electoral Commission to be a free, fair, legitimate, democratic referendum. And then all the Conservative MPs and all the Labour MPs were elected on their party's manifesto pledges to respect our referendum decision. And now, virtually every Labour MP and at least 21 Conservative MPs want to break those pledges they made, on which they were elected. If you're elected on a platform with which you disagree, is that not acting on false pretences? I think it is. These MPs are actually also trashing their earlier decisions. They did vote to hold the referendum. They did vote to enact the Withdrawal Act. And they voted to trigger Article 50, all by huge majorities. And now they're acting in contempt of the laws they themselves passed. Labour Party members should realise, incidentally, that staying in the EU makes the programme that was the rest of their manifesto illegal and impossible. And so should all trade union members understand that the EU treaties render Labour's programme, its pledges on the economy, on welfare, on the NHS, impossible to deliver because the EU treaties make all those pledges illegal. So if we were to stay, which we won't, if we were to stay in the EU and the Labour Party were to win an election, they couldn't carry out the promises on which they were elected. Now the Johnson government appears at the moment to be trying to carry out at last our referendum decision by committing to leave on the 31st of October, deal or no deal. And the pro-EU faction of MPs trying to overturn our democratic majority decision, not the government, is the threat to democracy. We had outside Westminster the other day, I was down there, as I have been so often, holding up the placards saying 17.4 million of us voted to leave, this is a majority, respect the majority. I was down there and the pro-EU people were saying stop the coup, and we were saying in response, yes, stop the EU coup. That's the one that's happening. That's the real coup that's being attempted when they suborn Parliament to overturn our democratic decision. We have a Johnson government that looks ready to implement Brexit, ready to do battle with the old establishment that was locked into the EU's ways. If you go into any negotiation, every trade unionist in the room knows this. Okay, you seek a deal. You'd like to get the employer to agree with you, but you do reserve the right to prepare for doing something different if the employer doesn't actually do what you want. So you prepare properly for a deal and you prepare for a no deal. Both must be credible to succeed. And Johnson's tactics, I think, have already made Angela Merkel shift the EU's position a little away from Donald Tusk's intransigent position. Some have said that Boris Johnson is unelected, but I think it was the Leave voters who put him in 10 Downing Street, not just the Conservative Party members. And then when he was elected by the when he was elected by the members of the party, it was by a 2-to-1 majority. Just as Labour Party members, oddly enough, elect their leader, and Liberal Democrat Party members elect their leader. And Johnson is an MP, of course. He was elected by a majority of his constituents. His party has more elected MPs than any other in the House of Commons. So it all seems fairly traditionally democratic, nothing particularly unusual there. By contrast, how does the EU operate? How democratic is the EU? 136,000 Conservative Party members, as I say, backed by 17.4 million Leave voters. By contrast, when the new European Commission President was appointed, it was by 28 politicians in the European Council. After 3 days of secret talks over the furious opposition of sidelined MEPs, they had no say at all. The European Parliament had proposed other nominees, but the Council just ignored that. The European Parliament was then required to ratify her appointment in an election. How many other candidates were allowed? Oh, none. No other candidates. And then these same 28 politicians, after these 3 days of very secret talks, they also appointed a new President of the European Council, a new President of the European Parliament, a new High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, and a new head of the European Central Bank, catastrophe Christine Lagarde, who has helped to wreck the French economy, the Argentinian economy, and the Greek economy. Watch out the Eurozone. Johnson said he will not try to revive the May EU withdrawal agreement. Michael Gove says something different. Johnson says it is dead, that agreement. But there is still a danger that he will accept some form of that disastrous deal, which would keep us in the EU's customs union, keep us still under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, with some fudging of the backstop maybe. And there's also a danger, even if and when we leave the EU, that the Johnson government might try to tie us into another TTIP. TTIP, remember, was of course this EU-US proposed deal that did directly threaten to open our NHS to US health corporations. And it was only an EU-US investors protection racket which privileged foreign investors and transnational companies. And we rejected it, just as we rejected the euro. We certainly wouldn't accept the TTIP Mark II. We didn't vote to leave one neoliberal trading bloc in order to join another one. We opposed US corporations taking over our NHS, of course. We also opposed European corporations taking over our NHS. We opposed British corporations taking over our NHS. So, we're quite consistent, I think. This is new political territory for lots of, I think it is new political territory. It's different times from anything we've experienced before. It's different for the EU as well, because they're rather used to popular resistance rolling over and submitting, as happened to poor Greece. Syriza the political party was trashed in no time. But to win the independence we voted for, the people must take responsibility for reshaping the country. We don't just want to go back to the old ways, the old establishment ways. We must fight to build a self-reliant economy and a new democracy, one that works for the people. And we must rebuild our trade unions, which have become very much over-dependent on let's ask the guys in Brussels to help us instead of taking up the fight ourselves. We've got some very good unions still in Britain, the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union in particular. There's others. There are other sectors of the big unions which are very effective as well. The London Ambulance Service, which is part of Unison, operates very effectively. Its members control their wages and conditions really well. They don't rely on Dave Prentice to do it for them. They don't rely on the EU to do it for them. They organise properly at their places of work, and that's what makes them successful. We have, all of us, I think, to work out how we make our countries better places to live and work in. But how can we do that when key decisions are taken by Brussels? How can countries improve their transport, energy and industry when EU rules enforce privatisation and limit state investment? There was a fairly quiet European Commission edict the other day, 25th of July, and it called on Ireland, Denmark, the Netherlands and Poland to fully transpose EU law. It decided, quote, to send a letter of formal notice to Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands and Poland for failing to transpose certain provisions of the EU rules on establishing a single European railway area. This directive aims to create a single European rail area, notably on competition issues, regulatory oversight, financial architecture of the railway sector, the power of national regulators, improved framework for investment in rail, and fair and non-discriminatory access to rail infrastructure and rail-related services. In November 2012, Member States adopted the directive and agreed to transpose those rules into national law by 16th of June 2015. The Member States concerned now have 2 months to reply, end quote. So you've got your orders from the Commission. We've had privatised rail in Britain. Does anybody here think it's been a great success? I mean, I don't think many people in Britain think it's been a great success. There are other things to say about Ireland. I'm sure you all know far better than I do. I've checked a few little things about the proposed backstop agreement. But the odd thing about all this is that the UK government, the Irish government and the EU have all given assurances that if the UK leaves without a withdrawal agreement, they will not introduce infrastructure or checks on the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. I know other times they say other things, but the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said, I've made it very clear to my counterpart in the UK and also to all the other EU Prime Ministers that under no circumstances will there be a border, full stop. He said on 24th of January that in the case of a no-deal outcome, the British and Irish governments, quote, would have to negotiate an agreement on customs and regulations that would mean full alignment so there would be no hard border, unquote. He also said, in terms of a no-deal scenario, we won't be installing a border between Northern Ireland and everyone knows that. He said that provision for a soft border is not mainly about trade, but is essential to keep the peace enshrined in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. The absurd non sequitur supported by failed Prime Ministers Tony Blair and John Major is that customs checks on goods travelling between North and South might somehow reignite the Troubles. This doesn't seem, please God, doesn't seem very likely. The Irish Republic's EU Commissioner Phil Hogan said that a way can be found to avoid animal and food checks on the border even in the case of a no-deal Brexit. The entire island of Ireland was already treated as one entity for animal and public health issues. Mr Hogan said, we'd like to continue that arrangement and I don't see any difficulty between the UK and the EU in respect of this. Even in a no-deal situation, we can put in place the necessary protocols so this would not be a problem, he said. President Donald Tusk said, if negotiations fail on the exit agreement, the European Union will not impose a border, customs post or any other kind of infrastructure on the frontier. When an Irish MP asked Commission President Juncker, if negotiations fail on the exit agreement, will you give us a clear commitment that the European Union will not impose a border, customs post or any other kind of infrastructure on the frontier? Juncker replied, yes. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has said if there were no deal, quote, we will have to find an operational way of carrying out checks and controls without putting in place a border. John Thompson, the head of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, said our consistent advice to ministers has been we do not require any infrastructure at the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland under any circumstances. And so has his Irish counterpart. Lars Carlsen, the former head of the World Customs Association, and Hans Mason, head of the Dutch Association of Customs Brokers, have both stated that no border infrastructure is needed to operate an effective customs operation. As Kate Hoey, Labour MP, one of the best Labour MPs, as she said in Parliament, quote, "The EU does not want a hard border and will not put one up. We will not put one up. The Republic of Ireland will not be putting one up. Who's going to put it up?" So, okay. Moving, you may be grateful, towards the end, but not quite yet. With independence, states can and must target investment where we need to transform industry, infrastructure and skills. Instead of allowing foreign fleets to use our fishing grounds, we should protect and support our fishing industry. Instead of EU mandated transport of live animals, which is legal under EU law but not under British law, bring in our own humane regulations and enforce import controls to stop the spread of plant diseases. Instead of EU promoted bus and rail privatisation, take national control to improve our transport and communications networks to sustain an increase in our economy. Instead of scrapping bursaries and charging fees for student nurses while importing nursing and medical staff from all over the world, especially from poorer countries in the EU and Africa and Asia, we should plan to develop our own skilled NHS workforce. And then we could do what Cuba does, which is actually educate so many nurses and doctors that we can send them to other countries which are poorer than us, which is what Cuba does. Instead of relying on open-door EU migration while dumping millions of young people into unemployment or minimum wage drudgery or 0 hours contracts, we could raise their skills in a planned way and enlist the young for the future so that we have the skills to succeed. Instead of an EU army, keep our military forces independent and protect our domestic defence industries. I talked earlier about the Jolly Brexiteers, and one of the chaps who is very active in that campaign, Sebastian Handley, lovely bloke, a real comedian, a musician, has written a brilliant book called Brexit, How the Nobodies Beat the Somebodies. I thoroughly recommend it. And a new epic struggle is defining our times, shaping the fight between the two contending classes. It's a new form of national liberation centred on sovereignty, independence, control over our material resources and intellectual resources, and it's worldwide. Waging that war, winning that war, will become a condition of survival for workers in every country. There's a clear choice. Either we live in sovereign, independent countries, deciding our own futures, or we're slaves to international capital. And this fight for national independence will not cease when we leave the EU, and it will not cease while capital still exists. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you very much, Will. And you certainly, there was food for thought there, and really, I think you encapsulated by saying it really is, at this stage, almost a battle for democracy itself. The second speaker tonight is somebody who I have huge respect for, and I mentioned earlier about the EU industry in Ireland, but the EU industry in Ireland, in probably its most vicious manifestation, is in the third level education, from all I can see. And everybody knows that faculty politics can be the most backbiting and vicious in the world. I know that myself because recently I've been invited around by European societies around the various third level institutions, and they invite me as a freak show, to be quite honest. This is a guy who doesn't agree with it, and you come in and everybody's smiling, and then you say a few things, and actually people often sometimes start arguing in the audience. Nobody ever told us this. Nobody told us that Ireland this year will be paying the EU a net contribution of 1.1 billion, which is the figure I got from the Department of Finance from FOI. And it's often very difficult to get figures in Ireland. People will regularly tell you it isn't available, and you find it elsewhere. But the level of antagonism towards any criticism of Europe is probably at its highest in the educational system, and it is worse in the third level system. So I know, Karen, by putting up your head above the parapet, you became a target for that. And as somebody said to me once when I made a mild criticism inside to a government minister, he said, "Ray, don't say that, it's career threatening," and it is career threatening to even question. And yet the third level should be the place where education and where discussion and open thought should be there. And I know Karen has come under a fair amount of pressure because of her views of that. The EU has a whole programme in Ireland, I think about 150 million in grants, but it's all Irish taxpayers' money. But people seem to be almost, that so grateful that the EU do this and the EU that. In fact, it's money that was raised in the country, goes to Brussels, has a large deduction made of it and comes back. But so I know that Karen has had difficulty fighting with that sort of suffocating uniformity, as they call it, in the third level areas, and it's often self-interest that drives that, because so many people are now have hitched their wagon personally and career-wise to the EU. That I think you've done a fantastic job, and you were out in the field and made a lot of the criticisms before it became as popular as it is today, and we're still not that popular, to be quite honest. But Karen was there right from the start, and I just want to say a huge thank you and say I have huge admiration.
I'm very honoured that Dr. Ray Bassett, who's a person who speaks truth to power, has said those things, and again, he's right in terms of the level of vitriol and the level of pressure that I do experience as a third level member of the third level. I teach the EU. I started teaching the EU in University of Aberdeen in 1999, so I'm 20 years now teaching the EU, and I constantly have to fight to continue to teach the EU due to internal departmental and faculty politics, and I don't think it's any surprise that I'm 13 years in the job and I've never been promoted, despite having the publications and the H-index and all of those other things that you need to have. But I won't give up my fundamental belief that academics should speak the truth.
Here.
And in my presentation I have some data that actually speaks to that, how the EU in a way has sewn up all of the voices at the third level in relation to EU funding, but also in relation to the teaching of the European Union to students. On that note, I don't know, could I make a last minute appeal to see if anyone in the audience happens to have a laptop with them that I might be able to show a PowerPoint presentation? No, okay, no problem. Well, what I have, I do have it on the laptop. It's too small for you to see, but I will make it available on the website afterwards. But I'll speak to it. And what I wanted to talk to you about this evening follows from a talk I was honoured to give here at the school in 2017, and I looked at the reasons why people voted for Brexit. And like Will Podmore said, it had nothing to do with racism. It actually had to do with the lowering of living standards and wages, particularly in those 10% of the lowest earners within the UK. And I suppose this is a continuation of that in a way, but I'm looking now at not necessarily just the reasons why Brexit happened, but the EU's role in Brexit. So the first thing, I'm going to have a little introduction where I talk about the nature of the EU in terms of how it works. And I use an analysis from Giandomenico Magione, who is a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, which is the European Union's university, which specialises in the study and research of the EU. So he's very well placed to talk to this. And then the next thing is who you can trust. So the European Commission carries out a survey called the Eurobarometer. So they ask a nationally representative sample of people every 6 months in the EU member states. And they ask, who do you trust? And do you trust the EU institutions among other institutions? And then I turn to the point that Dr. Ray Bassett so eloquently put in his introduction, which is, surely academics tell the truth? And so some confessions from what are called Jean Monnet professors. I'll explain what that Jean Monnet title before the word professor means. And then I turn to the actions of the EU in terms of why Brexit happened and the EU's role in that. Is it democratic? Is it trustworthy? Is it truthful? So we've seen changes to economic and fiscal powers that were seen to be very much against the interests of the UK. And I'll talk about the struggles of the UK in relation to those changes. Changing interpretations of the treaties. Again, Will Podmore talked about how the European Commission President was elected. I have a story to tell you about how David Cameron struggled to get the actual text of the treaties, the nature and spirit of the treaties, to be adhered to by the EU. And then key to the UK economy is financial services. And the EU wanted to bring in financial services regulation, which a lot of us on the left would be very much in favour of. But how did they do it? Was it democratic? And indeed, one of the UK's deepest problems was with the financial transaction tax. But I'm just going to look at it from the perspective of how the EU approached this and the reaction of the UK government to the EU's approach on what is seen by the UK establishment and government as a vital national interest. And then I shall conclude. So, the EU characteristics leading to Brexit. And can you all hear me, by the way? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Claiming to stand for certain values, but doing the exact opposite. So I'll give you an example of that, number one. Number two, the EU's operating principles, which brings in Professor Giandomenico Magione. 3, EU socialisation within the EU, which is a theory that academics use to try to explain why, for example, as Will Podmore pointed out, so many UK politicians may have voted to trigger Article 50 to allow Brexit, but then have done everything for the past 3 years, and certainly since 2017, to try to thwart the delivery of that. And then trust in the EU after 2009, the financial crisis and how the EU handled it. And finally, 5th, EU propaganda funding and the universities as the locus of truth-telling. Before I begin, a couple of background points. This is Prodi, who was the European Commission head at the time. He said, Europe's approach, this was in December 2002, we want to use the force of ideas and persuasion, not coercion. We have moved a long way from the reasons of state and from the realpolitik that we ourselves invented. Our concept of power is the power of rules. Okay, so bear this in mind. Our concept of power is the power of rules. Have they actually put those values into action? The idealism behind the EU's foundation is vital to defining who and what we are today. We have carefully built a zone of peace, democracy and the rule of law of more than 500 million people. This is Javier Solana, who was the EU's foreign policy representative, speaking at The Hague in 2006. And yet we know that the EU is not necessarily a zone of democracy and the rule of law from our own experiences of repeat referendums, which they are trying to inflict on the UK, but so far have failed. This is a photograph of some feedback at a We the Citizens gathering to discuss Ireland and the EU. And it says, Lisbon II broke our soul and delegitimized Europe. So we know, we have experience of how the EU has not acted in accordance with its stated values of honouring democracy and the rule of law. So this is Professor Giandomenico Magione's book. Europe as the would-be world power, the EU at 50. So this was published in 2009. He said that the EU is an elitist project. And he identifies 3 EU operating principles. And as someone who has taught the EU for 20 years and studied it for 30 years, I can tell you he's right. The first operating principle he identifies is integration has priority over all other competing values, including democracy. Jean Monnet said as much in his memoirs. Secondly, EU decision makers follow, wherever possible, the strategy of the fait accompli. The accomplished fact, which makes opposition and public debate useless. And I know this from studying the European security and defence policy and how it's evolved. They establish permanent structured cooperation, they establish the mutual defence clause, and 10 years later, the Irish government says the EU is thinking of establishing permanent structured cooperation. The EU is thinking of bringing in a mutual defence clause. And they're thinking, as an academic who's published on this, you brought it in 10 years ago, and here you are suggesting that the EU is thinking of doing it. It's already done. And you'll find that in nearly all of the discourses. If the EU is talking about bringing something in, go research it. It's probably already in the treaties and in place from 10 years ago. And then finally, the third operating principle, ultimate ends are largely irrelevant. What counts are procedures and the expansion of European competences. And what that means is that the EU gains more power to legislate across more and more areas. So this is written by a very esteemed academic who was close to retirement, and maybe he decided his conscience got the better of him, and as he was going to retire they couldn't take his pension away, and he actually put out a little bit of the truth of how the EU works. But Majone is you can Google him, and he's hugely cited as a European Union expert. And so those operating principles are something we need to bear in mind, which go against those stated values of rule of law and democracy. Okay, so elite socialization, the second little background point, it's basically saying, you can't read this, so I'm not going to go through it, but it just says that there is a transformation that takes place when people operate within the EU system over time. And what happens is they become socialized to accept certain norms, certain ways of doing things. The EU way of doing things. And he said that socialization in the adoption of EU rules, quote, implies that an agent switches from following a logic of consequences, in other words, is this good? What are the consequences of this law? To a logic of appropriateness. Is it appropriate in terms of the milieu, in terms of how everyone else is performing and behaving within the EU? This adoption is sustained over time and is quite independent from a particular structure of material incentives or sanctions. So he's saying, even if there's a stick to beat you with, you will still go along at home, for example, opposition domestically, you will still follow this logic of appropriateness over the logic of consequences. And the Irish government used to instrumentally resist EC pressures. Quote, there is no case to be made for sacrificing our vital national interests solely for the sake of being regarded as, quote, good Europeans. This is, I believe it or not, Bertie Ahern in Dáil Éireann. The theory suggests there'll be a change in identity and interests that gives priority to the promotion of solidarity within the EU over values of independence that have previously shaped national policy preferences. So the longer you're in the system, the more socialized you become to accept a logic of appropriateness rather than a logic of consequences. And I think we can know an Irish political party that may have particularly adapted to elite socialization. Dare we name it? Any suggestions from the audience? Perhaps Fine Gael? The old blue shirts, as they call themselves, have turned themselves into the blue and 12 gold star shirts. And this theory of centralisation would predict that that is what would happen. And then finally, because I discussed this over lunch with Will Podmore and Tony Coughlin, who kindly brought me out to join them at Trinity during the week. And we talked about trialogues. And so when we talk about the rule of law and democracy, we do need to talk about trialogues. Trialogues are informal meetings between a select group of people from the Parliament, the Commission and the Council. These are meetings that take place behind closed doors. They normally used to take place later in the decision-making process. First reading stage, second reading stage, third reading stage. Not to get too technical, these trilogues no longer take place in the process of these public stages of decision-making, but now predominantly take place before a proposal even gets into the public decision-making process of first reading, second reading and third reading. And the EU Ombudsman said it's difficult to find out when trilogues are taking place, what is being discussed and by whom, without a great deal of time and effort. Emily O'Reilly, EU Ombudsman. O'Reilly called for documents tracking the main stages of the trilogues to be published as soon as possible after the talks end. I've done a study with Dr. Carl Murphy into trilogues as to whether they are efficient and if they are transparent. And it turned out that they do boost efficiency. A trilogue file takes 3 months less to complete compared to a non-trilogue file. But in terms of transparency, a trilogue file is less transparent. So they have redacted, they've blocked out texts, or they've made documents wholly unavailable to be seen. But even more than trilogues, what we found was the biggest predictor of levels of redaction, of crossing out, blackening out text so you can't see what it says, is the size of the budget attached to the legislative file. So the bigger the budget, several billion attached to a legislative file, the bigger the level of redaction. The smallest level of budget, a couple of million to 100 million, very little redaction. And so transparency is actually correlated with money. The more money, the less transparency. And then we can look at trust in politicians in the EU between 2004 and 2018, and we can see that trust in the EU plummeted after 2009, basically after it bailed out the 1% at the expense of the 99%, where 1 in 3 people, less than 1 in 3 people, trust the institutions of the EU. Which is not much different to trusting national governments and national parliaments. But this is what's interesting in terms of the point made by Dr. Ray Bassett. So this looks at, it's called the Veracity Index, and it looks at to the extent that British people trust people in certain occupations. It's called the Veracity Index. And this is data from 2017 and 2018. And so they list professions like nurses. I think it's 94 or 98% trust nurses, doctors, teachers. But here in the fourth place is professors. 85% of Britons trust professors to tell the truth. Right down at the bottom, unfortunately, at 17% is politicians. And if you look at the 2018 data, it's not that much different. Professors go up a notch. They're trusted by 86% of Britons to tell the truth. Politicians, 19% trust them to tell the truth. So developing the introductory point by Dr. Bassett, this is questioning whether Britons should actually trust professors. of EU studies to tell the truth. And this is where I explain to you what the Jean Monnet lectures are. This is basically a conference that was held in 2014 to celebrate 30 years of Jean Monnet programs, which is funded by you and I, the taxpayers. Over the past 25 years, Jean Monnet activities have helped create a community of 4,000 professors, 1,000 chairs of European studies, over 2,000 study modules and 200 centres of excellence. The programme supports professors specialised in European integration at universities in 78 countries on the 5 continents, reaching 250,000 students and researchers every year. So it's good money, reaching a lot of people. I think I'm the only non-Jean Monnet professor in Ireland, and perhaps the British Isles, who teaches the EU and is not funded by the EU. And this is Professor Joseph H. Weiler, who was the president of the European University Institute that I mentioned earlier, and he wanted to talk about this Jean Monnet professor. Again, he was coming to the end of his tenure, so for some reason he suddenly decided to be truthful. It's interesting what he said. He said, finally, as president of the European University Institute, I've been offered an interesting glimpse at the complex world of funded research in our field. Not just those who study and research the EU, but any third-level project in the hard sciences or in the social sciences gets its money from the EU. 100% of all research funding comes from the EU. Okay, so all serious kind of professors and researchers have to apply to the EU. So there's a certain dependency there. He said, I would like to emphasise that I speak in my personal capacity and none of the views I express should be attributed to the EUI. It's titled The Jean Monnet Professor, A Life of Inbuilt Contradiction. The life of a Jean Monnet professor, and of many others in this particular field of European studies, is a life of contradiction. What is that contradiction? On the one hand, part of our mission as Jean Monnet professors is to disseminate the values of European integration. The Commission, the initiator of this hugely successful programme, think of us openly as intellectual ambassadors of the Union and its values. We've heard such comments of the President and the Commissioner and in the written literature accompanying this conference. And they also think of us quite rightly as a resource for developing policies for the Union. So he says actually that promoting and being intellectual ambassadors of the Union and its values is their primary objective. But this mission is in complete contradiction to the academics' primary mission, which is to pursue the truth. And he said, at an even deeper level, most of us become Jean Monnet professors because in complicated ways we believe in European integration. It is not only a professional commitment to many of us, but also a kind of credo. For example, when the European Union is criticised, our instinct is to defend it. And he says that even those who are not Jean Monnet professors come to it with ideological baggage of one which it does not necessarily find in comparable areas of the social sciences, area studies and the like. So he's saying that only those who teach the EU have this inbuilt contradiction. In no other area is this seen. He said, we are Jean Monnet professors. Before we are Jean Monnet professors, I beg your pardon, we are professors. And as scholars, we are committed to dispassionate critical inquiry without partisan political bias, to the extent possible. The pursuit of truth is not a cliche in this context. It is a vocation, and it's a commitment which must be honoured, even if it is uncomfortable to the institutions, the funders of the Jean Monnet programmes, as well as other relevant stakeholders. But in fact, no Jean Monnet professor has ever been able to reconcile their instinct to defend the EU when it is criticised with the pursuit of truth, even if it is uncomfortable for the institutions, the funders of the Jean Monnet programme. And so the 85% of Britons who trust professors to tell the truth are sadly misled, because no university academic who is expert in the EU ever tells the truth about the European Union, because they're all Jean Monnet professors. And that is a serious indictment against the profession of academia. So just to go into the actions then leading to Brexit. How much time do I have? I presume only about 10 minutes to it. 5?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Well,
5 to 10.
luckily these will only take a minute each, hopefully.
Flexibility.
The first is breaking the law in the treaties, the no bailout clause. The second is creating the fiscal compact and the stability mechanisms outside the EU legal framework. The third is reinterpreting the treaty texts in terms of how you elect the European Commissioner, head. Inventing a new Commission DG for financial services that excluded the UK. And then finally, new laws for an EU financial transaction tax, which the UK was against and took the EU to court to try to fight the proposals. So I'll briefly just tell you about each of those. So what's the ESM? Well, it's basically that up to €500 billion bailout fund. And I can give you some evidence here. This is Pierre Lelouch, who is the French Minister for European Affairs. In an interview with Financial Times, 27th of May 2010, he said that creating bailout funds reflected an unprecedented de facto change to current treaties. He said, quote, "It is an enormous change. It explains some of the reticence. It's expressly forbidden in the treaties by the famous no bailout clause. De facto, we have changed the treaty." You're not allowed to change the treaty. It has to go through an intergovernmental conference, then it has to go through parliaments, or in Ireland it must go through a referendum. But they avoided that. Christine Lagarde, who Will Podmore is talking about, she was quoted by the Wall Street Journal in December 2010 saying, quote, "We violated all the rules because we wanted to close ranks and really rescue the Eurozone. The Treaty of Lisbon was very straightforward. No bailout." So the concept of debt mutualisation, and this is from the House of Lords, and it was from 2014, it's by Lord Harrison. So the UK Parliament knew that the bailout clause was being violated by the introduction of bailouts and the stability mechanism. It said that debt mutualisation was explicitly ruled out. It was a cardinal principle at the time, very much on Germany's understandable insistence that there should be no bailout mechanism. Of course, when the euro got into trouble, we had the bailout of both Greece and Ireland, which Madame Lagarde pointed out was probably illegal under the treaty because the treaty specifically prevented bailouts. So the EU basically violated its own treaties to instigate this bailout mechanism, which, as we know, was simply to ensure that companies like Goldman Sachs didn't have to pay out on naked credit default swaps. I think I might have covered this in previous talks. So, although you can't see this, this is headlines from the Independent newspaper. The EU leaves Britain. Not Britain leaves the EU, but the EU leaves Britain. And EU leaves UK out in the cold. So what are we talking about? You know the City of London is home to the UK financial services industry, which is basically banking, selling securities, insurance and related services like accounting and auditing. And that makes up 10% of the UK economy, so it's sizable. And it's one of the few areas that the UK has a trade surplus with the EU. Here's some interesting facts. About 70% of the EU's foreign exchange trading and about 40% of global trading in euros actually takes place in the UK. The UK hosts 85% of the EU's hedge fund assets, 42% of EU private equity funds, half of EU investment bank activity, and half of EU pension assets and international insurance premiums. The UK attracts more foreign direct investment than any other EU member state, and financial services is a pretty big part of that. It attracts more FDI than any other sector. So this is really important to the UK and its economy. So here's a quote, and this is in relation to the EU's efforts to create the stability mechanism and the fiscal compact. a whole bailout and debt sharing regime. After 11 hours of bad-tempered talks, Mr. Cameron said that he had blocked the changes because France and Germany had refused to agree a protocol giving the City of London protection from a wave of EU financial services regulations related to the Eurozone crisis. Nicolas Sarkozy said that Britain had made unacceptable demands for exemptions from certain financial regulations in return for joining the fiscal compact. So the UK was blocking it in an attempt to protect that part of its economy, and they came to an impasse. So every EU treaty needs all the member states, then there was 27 member states, to agree to it for it to become law. So once you say one state says no, you can't pass the treaty. But the EU didn't accept this, even though it's part of their own rules. They decided to try and circumvent the veto of the UK. And so even though the German Constitutional Court said that you do need a new treaty for this, what they did was essentially create an intergovernmental treaty outside of the EU legal system, which is completely incompatible with the EU treaties themselves. So again, they broke their own treaties, primary law, in order to carry out policies that were also illegal under the treaties. And not only that, the kicker for the UK was that in Article 16 of the Fiscal Compact, it predicted the transfer of this law to EU treaties after a five-year period. In other words, it assumed within 5 years that the UK would buckle under pressure, sign the treaty, so it could become official EU law. Obviously that didn't happen. I've already talked about this before, the Spitzenkandidat. This is where the EU treaties basically say that how you elect the head of the European Commission is by all of the heads of state and government, as Will Podmore pointed out, 18 politicians meeting in the European Council to decide who gets nominated for the post. But the treaty text says taking into account the results of the European elections. However, Angela Merkel and Sarkozy decided to reinterpret this, taking into account the European elections, to mean that whatever European political grouping, and it was going to be the EPP, according to the polls, whatever political grouping wins the most seats in the parliament after the election gets the post. So, in fact, the heads of state don't decide who is nominated. It's whatever political grouping, whoever they nominate, whoever gets the most seats gets that position. And so Jean-Claude Juncker was the EPP nominee. David Cameron went to the European Council thinking that they were going to discuss who was going to be nominated, and Angela Merkel turned around and said, no, we have Spitzenkandidat. And so the EPP got the greatest share of seats in the European Parliament, and so Jean-Claude Juncker is in fact the head of the Commission forthcoming. And David Cameron said, but you can't do that, it's against the treaties. And they said, well, we're saying that that's what the treaties say. Now, interestingly, when I presented this to my students, my first year students, I showed them, this was in March 2019, earlier this year, I showed them some of the predictions of the 2019 European Parliament elections, where the EPP were going to lose an awful lot of seats to the far left and to the far right. And so I asked them, there's about 370 of them, I asked them, how many of you think, based on these predictions, that the EPP and Angela Merkel will be demanding the use of the Spitzenkandidat, given that the EPP probably won't be the most numerous, won't have the most seats in the Parliament. And overwhelmingly the students said they won't be trying to get the Spitzenkandidat process to be used. And was the Spitzenkandidat process used? No, it wasn't, because the EPP didn't have enough seats to claim the position. So we have France and Germany reinterpreting the text of the treaties to suit their own political purposes, which David Cameron of the UK tried to stop and couldn't. And that was one of the biggest straws that broke the camel's back that led to Brexit. Now, finally, I'm going to whiz through these, my last two. Let me keep going. Yeah, so this second last point is about how the European Commission has a DG for the internal market. It's a Directorate General, it's a section. just like we have departments in the Irish civil servants. This is the department, civil service branch of the Commission in charge of the single market. And they control financial services as part of the single market within this DG, Directorate General. And this is Lord Kerr who spoke in the House of Lords, and he said the position that the government take up, that banking union has nothing to do with us, but is a matter for Eurozone countries, could mean that the UK government don't object to the proposal, much discussed in Brussels at the moment, that the heavily overloaded Commission single market DG should be split, with banking and financial legislation moving to the Financial Directorate General. That would be disastrous from the point of view of UK interests. And it was the British Bankers Association that said it is of utmost importance to maintain the structure of the relevant Commission services dealing with financial services. We suggest that the government should proactively defend the unity of DG market and oppose any plan to move financial services out of it. So this was in 2014. Now, obviously, this was before the Spitzenkandidat affair. I strongly agree, this is what the Lord Kerr said, I strongly agree with the Banking Association, and I hope that the Minister will be able to reassure us that we shall, to the extent of our current influence allows, work to ensure it doesn't happen. It's highly desirable and important that the current head of the Single Market Director General, who was then Jonathan Fall, a UK civil servant, the most senior of the very small and dwindling band of British personnel in the Commission, should stay where he is. What matters is that he covers all of the work that is of interest to the City of London, right? So then you have Cameron trying to stop Jean-Claude Juncker becoming head of the Commission. And the power of the head of the Commission is to rearrange the Directorate Generals. So what do you think happened? When he got into power, we have the new year brings change to the Commission. Alterations to the European Commission's departmental structure to take effect. And this is on the 5th of January, after the Christmas break of 2015. And so what were the changes? Jonathan Fall is no longer in charge of financial services. He's moved to strategic issues related to the UK referendum. So he was shoved into a Brexit type role. And they decided to take financial services out and put it into its own DG. Who do you think they put in charge of it? It wasn't a UK person. Can you guess what nationality Jean-Claude Juncker put in?
German.
Or? French. So here we have the Frenchman. His name is Olivier Guerssant. And he is the person who is in charge of financial stability, financial services, and the Capital Markets Union. Do you know who the deputy would be?
German.
No, actually. Second guess? Ireland. Yeah, so this deputy DG is an Irishman called John Berrigan. So the UK has now, in 2015, after Jean-Claude Juncker got the reins of power, been totally thrown out of the one area of the Commission that they needed to control for their own economy, from their own perspective. Brexit, anyone? So then, finally, last point. Oh, have I gone really over time now?
We'll keep
Okay,
going.
last
It's
point.
very interesting.
Last one is the financial services tax, okay, the FTT. It's a proposal to tax secondary financial transactions, so involving shares, bonds, entering into trading of secondary derivatives, etc. So it was supposed to cover all of that, and the budget it would raise would be 57 billion euros, which is a fair amount of money that could be put into the EU budget. And the European Commission proposed this, but obviously because the UK is the biggest player in the financial transaction service area, this would be a huge tax on its activities, much more compared to, say, Frankfurt or Paris. And so they vetoed it, right, because it was subject to unanimity. All now 28 members had to agree. So what did the European Commission decide to do? To avoid the veto, they decided to use a special procedure called enhanced cooperation. So a select group of member states could decide to deploy this law themselves and leave out the UK. So in other words, the EU was going to bring it in anyway. And so what did the UK do? It brought a case to the European Court of Justice arguing that the use of enhanced cooperation was illegal. How many of you think it won its case?
0.
Correct. So it lost its case. And so now they haven't actually managed to bring in the tax yet because there were other objections to it. But again, from the UK's perspective, it may be in the EU, but it is losing power all of the time, okay, to the Franco-German axis. So finally, my very last point is, and this is Olaf Grimsson, who was president of Iceland in 2010, and he talked about it in terms of the financial crisis. In our case, it was a decision taken by our own government and our own parliament. We had full control over that decision-making mechanism. This is in relation to some of their banks going bankrupt. But fundamentally, this is not just a financial crisis, it is also a fundamental test of our democratic systems. Ireland didn't have the ability to decide itself, the EU decided for it, and slammed us into the bailout. And so if the EU is not democratic, if it's not trustworthy, if it's unwilling to tell the truth, and if it continues to break its own laws in ways that go against the UK's interests, what reason for the UK to stay? So this is an outline of some of the very small tip of the iceberg details of how the actions of the EU predated a decision to hold a referendum on Brexit. Thanks. Sorry for going.
Thank you very much, Karen. And you brought some memories back to me, because even at ministerial or at the top of the civil service level, it's sometimes impossible to find out who actually agreed to something. Because sometimes you'll be told you can't do that because it's now an EU competency, and you sort of ask, well, when did we and who agreed? And nobody knows, because there's so many committees, there's so many of this aid function, and I've seen ministers pull their hair out and said, what Irish official agreed to this transfer? And nobody knows. You couldn't find it because there's a labyrinth there. There's so many organisations, and also the sort of conditioning that people who go in originally to dealing with European matters often have quite a good sense of balance. And after a few years, there's almost a house training of them. To be honest, I always resisted going near the European Union side, and even one stage when somebody suggested I go to Brussels when we were blocking a particular directive, and if they can't stop you, they sometimes co-opt you. And I said, I can't work for something with which I have no identification. And as I say, I'm very surprised at how people get torn into this. And you got to understand that people in the Taoiseach's Department of Foreign Affairs are regularly in Brussels. They regularly are in commission jobs and moving backwards. Foreign Affairs and the Taoiseachs are interchangeable all the time. A lot of people who've work in both at different stages, but a lot of these people have actually worked inside the Commission and are for organisations and come back, and it's a what do you call it? I think it's a corrupting influence, because sometimes if you move to the Commission, you can massively increase your personal wealth. And also, I remember at a meeting once, I suggested that officials who deal with Europe should be banned for 5 years from taking a job in Europe, and I thought the person's option were going to collapse, because this was a big issue for them, because how can you negotiate on behalf of your country with your future employer? Because there's such a conflict of interest. In a lot of areas you cannot do that, but yet people move backwards and forwards all the time into commission jobs where they're massively paid more, their tax is much lower and everything. And I always ask the question as to, if people agree with the European ideal, why do we have to pay them so much? Why, surely there should be a bit of teargrach or sort of, if you believe in the ideal, you shouldn't have to be paid. And particularly for some countries where wages would be low, particularly in the eastern side of the EU, taking a job in the European Union can triple or quadruple your salary. So how can you operate in a dispassionate way? But the other thing is the education system seems to be, it's not just at the Jean Monnet level. And every time I open my mouth I get attacked by a Jean Monnet professor. They're kind of like squatting them like flies. But I just discovered when I was writing this book about this Blue Star program that there are now programs in primary school to popularise the European Union. And I was talking to some people in the campaign for an independent Britain, and they said, there was a generation almost that it was very difficult to get to, because they'd gone to school in Britain and they had got all these EU flags and pieces of information. And of course it appears to be free to the school, but of course the taxpayer again has paid it. But as for the Court of Justice, I mean, nobody in a government believes that the Court of Justice is going to find in any way other than integrationist policy, and they will bend every rule and they will change precedent and everything. Nobody believes, and in fact some of the judges in the Court of Justice are not judges, they're actually people appointed there. So, if you're looking for justice in appealing a treaty violation by the European Commission, you're not going to get it, except in a very, very odd case where they may do it just to show that they have a slight degree of independence. Okay, I've got that off my throat, off my chest, and I think now it's time to actually bring the audience into it, and I think we'll start taking questions. And of course, if you can keep the questions reasonably short, we can get through as many as possible.